So hi, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this RSCtv webinar. We're focusing on ETNA, giving you an overview of the findings of the Scottish FE Technology Survey. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Celeste McLaughlin and I'm an advisor at Jisc RSC Scotland. My focus is staff development, and you see my email and my Twitter details there if you're interested in following up any of the stuff that I'm speaking about this afternoon. And also, I have a colleague, Penny Robertson, joining me today as well. She is in the background at the moment moderating, but we have both been working on the ETNA survey for the past year plus. So Penny has a fair bit of knowledge about ETNA as well. So I'm glad she's joining me today. So what I'm planning on covering then, this is the session outline. And as Penny had mentioned previously, I'm planning on just delivering the presentation, and then at the end I'll stop to invite any questions or thoughts or encourage discussion about ETNA. But if something occurs to you during my presentation, please do feel free to enter your thoughts or comments into the chat pane, and we'll pick those up at the end as we are asking for more questions. If you do have access to a headset with a mic, then we will invite you to use that at the end of the presentation. So if you're brave enough to open up your mic, we'll invite you to do that at an appropriate point. So the session outline then is on the screen, and I'm expecting this to take around 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a bit of time at the end for any questions and discussion. This session is due to finish around 1:15. So, give you a wee bit of background and history about ETNA, and ETNA stands for the Enhanced Training Needs Analysis. And really, it's a survey that aims to identify a kind of clearer picture or a snapshot of the use of technology in the Scottish FE sector. The survey really focuses on Scottish FE, and one of the objectives is to identify the technology training needs of the sector. But the survey is also intended to inform strategic planning and decision making across the sector. And it's certainly used quite heavily by ourselves at the RSC during the kind of planning process that we go through each summer. And I know certainly other agencies in Scotland have had feedback that they have certainly used ETNA just to inform their thoughts and their planning as well. So this is the fifth time we've ran the ETNA survey. The previous surveys have been published in 2001, 2003, 2007 and 2010. And those are all available on our website, and Penny has kindly just put in a wee link to previous versions of ETNA. If you're interested in having a wee scan at those, you're welcome to do that. And what this has done is given us the opportunity over the last kind of 10 plus years to kind of get an idea of the kind of changing landscape of technology use in the Scottish FE sector. So it's been a valuable tool for us. And quite a lot has changed in that period. The first survey in 2001, when we compare the current survey to that, we found that many of the technologies now have become mainstream technologies, such as the VLE have certainly become embedded in the college sector. And we've seen staff and students getting better access to digital resources, both on and off campus, which offers a great deal more flexibility. And we've also seen a growth in the use of mobile technologies, also the use of home broadband as well, and the use of social media. So all of these provide opportunities for the wider adoption of learning technologies. So moving on to look at the current ETNA survey then. This survey was conducted during October, November of last year, so just around about a year ago now we were conducting the survey. The survey was made available to staff in the sector for around 3 to 4 weeks. And we did have a wee incentive to encourage staff to participate as well. I think we conducted the survey we do the survey roughly every 3 or so years, and at the time we were conducting the survey it was just about when there was about to be major changes happening in the sector. There was lots of colleges either just preparing to go through merger or knew they had a merger coming up within the next year or so. So I think that it'll be interesting to see the impact of regionalisations and the mergers that are taking place just now in the next iteration of ETNA. But the current ETNA, the data was analysed with the help of one of my colleagues, Mandy Nelson, who's Market Research Manager at Jisc, and as I said before, Penny and myself have been focusing on ETNA. That's been a major part of our workflow in the last year or so, and we all contributed to the writing of the reports. Penny has just put a link up onto the screen there of where you can find the current report for ETNA. We made this report available in a slightly different format than previous ETNA publications. What we did was provide an overview report, a key findings report, which as the name would suggest, highlights the kind of key findings from the survey. But what we also did was publish a number of staff category reports. These reports will give a bit more detail of the findings that were asked in each of the surveys which we conducted. And you can see the details of the staff categories on your screen there at the moment. So all those reports are available. The key findings report was launched in June, just at our annual conference, and the individual staff category reports were written and produced over the summer months. So they are now all available on our website. And for the first time, we introduced the learning technologists as a staff category. So I think that was about time we had done that, and given the importance of that role as far as learning technologies within the sector. We had around 1,700 responses for the 2012 survey, which is roughly about 10% of the FE college staff at the time of the survey. The numbers were lower than in previous surveys, and I think this is just really a reflection of the changes that are taking place in the sector at the moment, and the impact these changes are having on people's roles and various kind of restructures and voluntary severances, etc. I think that did impact on the number of responses that we got for the survey. However, we did get a response rate that we were fairly happy with. So what I'll do then is move on to highlight some of the key findings then. So the good news then is that technology is fairly well embedded in colleges in Scotland, and the respondents were fairly positive in their attitudes about technology, which is good to hear. Technology is seen as a useful tool for supporting learning and teaching, but importantly, it shouldn't be seen as a replacement for face-to-face methods. That came across quite clearly from respondents. And also, we shouldn't assume that all students have access to technology, and if they do have access to technology, we shouldn't assume that they can use particular technologies in a learning and teaching context. So that's something to be aware of. Looking at the skills and abilities, and the findings would indicate quite a good confidence in a number of packages, in using a number of software packages for the various roles and staff categories. So the technologies on the left, they are using email, word processing, and spreadsheets. This was all respondents had a fairly high level of confidence in using these tools. However, there were other tools that there was less confidence reported. So using tools and software to write to the web, using apps, knowing how to acquire apps, using cloud services. These were all technologies where there is less confidence in using these. And I think this just highlights the fact that there has been an improvement in the digital skill set of staff working in this sector. but technology is constantly changing and evolving, so I think there will always be a need to update our technology skills as new technologies come on board and start to be embedded and become mainstream. So I think that's our technology skills will constantly be evolving. So what I thought would be useful then was just to quickly highlight one or two of the training needs to emerge in each of the staff categories we surveyed. You'll find much more detail about the training needs if you're interested in the individual reports, but given the kind of time limitations we have today, I thought it would be useful just to highlight one or two that came across quite strongly and I thought were of interest. So starting first with senior managers, and they identified a training need for emerging technologies. In particular, they were interested about the potential impact of emerging technologies across college operations. But they were also interested in how e-learning in particular might be utilised to meet the challenges they face just now with regionalisation. Middle managers were quite focused on e-learning as well, and this featured in many of their identified needs. And they were interested in how it can be integrated into the quality improvement agenda, and also how it might meet the needs of regionalisation. So you can see there regionalisation certainly has a strong focus for those staff categories of senior managers and middle managers. Moving on to learning resources staff, I thought it was quite interesting to note they had a need for training in systems such as repositories, and they were interested in integration of the VLE and the library management system as well. Learning technologies, as I say, this was the first time that we introduced this as a kind of standalone staff category. Obviously, in previous iterations of ETNA, learning technologies would have contributed to different surveys, maybe the academic one or perhaps the support staff, just depending on what their particular role was in their college. But the training needs they identified were around social media tools and e-portfolios. Learning technologies indicated that they use social media tools quite extensively as we would expect, but they trained others in using these tools but had received limited training themselves. And I think this maybe reflects the fact that technology evolves quickly, so trying to get your heads around all the kind of new tools is maybe a bit of an impossible task. So I think that's maybe where that comes from. And also e-portfolio systems as well. The learning technologies and the survey respondents indicated that there was an e-portfolio system available in many of the colleges, but less than a third of learning technologists who responded to the survey used the e-portfolio system regularly, and they didn't feel it was essential to their work. And they were probably the one category that did use e-portfolios more than others. And a small number of learning technologists indicated they did deliver training in e-portfolio systems themselves as well. So I think this is an area where they felt there was further development required. Moving on to look at network and technical staff. This is quite a kind of specialised category, and this is reflected in the kind of specialised technology-focused training needs identified there, and you can see a list on your screen. As far as admin and support staff are concerned, this is a bit of a kind of catch-all category, and there's quite a range of staff roles contribute to this category. So they all have different job roles and professional focuses, and I think this is reflected in the range of training needs identified there as well. So quite a range of training needs, just depending on what the focus of their particular role was. Moving on to the training needs of practitioners then. And this particular question I'm highlighting was asking respondents to indicate the aspects of e-learning and e-assessment where training would be of particular benefit to them. And you can see on the table there was There was quite a high training need identified, in particular with designing and developing e-learning materials, also designing flexible or blended delivery, and also locating third-party e-learning materials. So that's me kind of just picking out the highest percentages there. But there was a range of other training needs identified. And this is the same question. I just put it over 2 slides just because there was so much information and it would have been difficult to read, I suspect. Where there was a training need identified that was a wee bit lower in the response percentages, then this was things like facilitating web conferences, using technology for collaboration, and using technology for e-moderating and e-tutoring. So although those were kind of quite lowly identified as far as the table is concerned, there was still a reasonable percentage looking for or identifying that type of training need. I thought what would be useful to do then was to look at a few emerging themes then. There's quite a lot of information in ETNA, but I thought I would just pick out a few themes that I thought were quite interesting. The themes that I thought I would focus on are those of social media, the use of VLEs, and the use of e-assessment tools. So first of all, looking at social media, there has been, and nobody will be surprised at this, there has been quite a growth in the use of social media within learning and teaching. We're seeing it being used much more within an educational context. What I think has changed in this iteration of the survey compared to the last one is that more social media tools are widely available across colleges. A few years ago we were seeing much more blocking of social media tools. However, there were some tools still blocked in a small number of colleges. Tools like Facebook, Twitter and YouTube were still blocked in a small number of colleges. There was quite a variation in the use of these tools being used both within particular colleges and across the sector as a whole. YouTube by far was the most popular tool. And the majority of academics agreed that social media tools can enhance the quality of learning and teaching. However, there was still a small number of respondents who considered social media tools to be a distraction and that they should remain in the social space. So there's still that debate happening about social media, whether it should be used as a social tool or whether it should be used within the learning and teaching context. And I published a blog post during the summer about social media use in Scottish FE if you're interested in a wee bit more of my thoughts around that. And I've also included some examples about the use of social media in Scottish FE. There's a few links on that blog post, and Penny has put the URL to that blog post in the chat pane there. So social media training needs then. Sorry, I'm trying to move on to the next slide and it's not doing what it's told. There we are, that's us now. So this is just a table of the identified training needs in the use of social media for those staff categories where there was an identified need. So less than 10% of respondents indicated that they had received any training in social media tools. So it's quite a low number of respondents had received training. And there was a need identified across a range of staff categories: academic, admin and support, learning resources, learning technologies. And you can see the range of tools that we asked about there and the percentage respondents who indicated an identified training need. And you'll see the numbers of staff who responded to that question just at the bottom there. And Penny's just kindly highlighting the fact that we have a case study initiative happening at RSC Scotland. I'm sure many of you will know about that, but the good thing about this is it gives us the opportunity to share good practice in the sector, and there are many examples of social media use in an educational context within our case studies on our website. So follow that link and you'll be able to find some information about that. So moving on then and looking at, there we are, mouse working now, the use of virtual learning environments within the sector then. And I think the thing that came across very strongly in this ETNA was the fact that the VLE is firmly embedded within colleges. and the majority of respondents, many staff categories, but academic respondents in particular, indicated that they did use it and that it has the potential to enhance the student experience. However, there was evidence that students do not engage well with the VLE. That came across fairly strongly. And I think that might be because that many of the VLE tools are still underutilised. Perhaps the VLE would engage students more if some of the features such as the assessment tools and the communication tools were used to the full potential. And again, I recently wrote a blog post about the use of VLE tools and my thoughts around that. And Penny's just put the URL there. And I've also highlighted some case studies about examples of effective VLE use within the education sector in Scotland as well. So there are many examples of very good use of the VLE, but I think still an area for work. But good news that it is becoming embedded as a tool within the sector. So moving on to look at the training needs that were identified. And I think the thing that comes across strongest is there was a training need identified in the use of e-assessment and communication tools. There was also a training need identified for creating and authoring content for the VLE as well. So that is something that still needs a wee bit of work on. Sorry, I'm taking my time moving between slides because I'm having trouble with my mouse. There we are. Actually, Penny, I might have to ask you to move on the next slide if you don't mind. Thank you very much. Okay, so moving on to look at the use of e-assessment tools. Just from what I've said there, unsurprisingly, the VLE assessment tools are not typically used for e-assessment. However, colleges do have a range of other tools available to them for use, and some of the tools identified in the survey were Solar, Gola, Evolve, and Turnitin. So there are a range of tools available, but they're not typically used within colleges. And I think respondents considered that the e-assessment did have the potential to enhance the quality of the learning experience for the learners, but that they felt that students did not engage well with them. So I think this is an area that certainly does need a wee bit more investigation, certainly more support, the use of e-assessment tools within the sector. Penny, I'm going to have to ask you to move on slides for me again. Sorry, don't know what's happening at this end. Thank you. So that table that has just appeared on the screen there just indicates that the use of e-assessment tools within the sector. There was a kind of smaller number who answered this question. So I think what comes across there is that the tools really aren't typically used. They're used by a kind of smaller percentage of respondents. So yeah, an area of focus, I think, for us at the RSC, definitely. And I think this was kind of similar findings to the previous ETNA, the survey published in 2010. I think the figures had went up slightly, but not massively. So an area for further support, I think, from us. Thanks, Penny. You read my mind there. So training preferences then, we did ask respondents what their preference was as regard to CPD, and I think what comes across strongly is the preference is definitely for face-to-face training sessions. The majority of respondents indicated that as a top preference, and traditional face-to-face workshops. However, there was a high percentage who would be happy with a blended delivery, a mixture of face-to-face and online delivery. However, the least favoured training delivery were for video conferencing, webinars, and structured courses supported wholly online. So I think definitely we've got a wee bit of work to do as far as online delivery of CPD is concerned. If I just get Penny to move on to the next slide for me. Thank you. So definitely face-to-face is considered by respondents to be the most effective. And there was various reasons for this. They felt just in the open responses that we received that it was the best for facilitating learning through tutor support, through group discussions, and through other interactions. And online learning really didn't have these kind of benefits. They felt that the interactive element in an online environment wasn't as good as face-to-face. So next slide again, Penny, thanks. Great. So although the preference was for face-to-face, then there were in the responses received that there was an acknowledgement that online training delivery did have many benefits. That I highlighted a few of them there: the saving of time, cost, and the flexibility it offers. I think the second quote that I've got on the screen kind of highlights maybe one of the factors that influences the kind of negative perception of online CPD. Staff quite often try to get involved in this type of CPD in their workroom, at their desk, and get lots of interruptions, so that they don't feel able to participate perhaps in some of the discussions that are taking place, some of the interactions, or they don't get the time and space to be able to participate fully. So I think a lot of people feel if they actually get away from their desk, then they get more time to focus on the CPD. And I recently had a conversation around this. I had an event with many of the contacts that we work with in the sector, many e-learning colleagues and staff development managers, and the discussion I had, what came across from them was they weren't really surprised with the findings, and they did acknowledge though that the reality is there were less opportunities for face-to-face delivery of CPD. So I think it's an area that we're going to have to focus on and perhaps support the use of delivery of online training and hopefully make it a better experience. I think there's been lots of people who have in the past had a bad experience of online learning, and they maybe been involved in courses that hadn't been designed particularly well or hadn't been supported particularly well, or perhaps just due to commitments elsewhere they didn't have the time or the space to devote as much time as they needed to the online sessions. And I know certainly I have had experiences of that in my past. I've had quite a long and varied career in learning in an online environment, and I've had some good and bad experiences, so definitely I would go along with that. But there's no getting away from the fact that online learning does have many advantages, and I think there's going to be a stronger need for more training delivered or more CPD delivered in an online environment, just because of some of the changes that we're facing at the moment. Thank you, Penny. Just moving on my slides for me. So I thought I would just kind of finish up by, I've not been able to bring out everything that we found in the survey, so I thought I would just pick out one or two areas of interest that I wanted to identify. I think ebooks and mobile learning in general came across as an area where there is a lot of change taking place. There has been an increase in the use of ebooks. There is a higher general awareness of them, and it's definitely an area of growth. I think there's going to be more purchasing of ebooks in the sector, but at the moment there's not very many people actually creating ebooks, so that might be an area to look out for and see what happens in the future. But certainly there are more people using mobile devices in general. There's better access to Wi-Fi networks, And the area of bring your own device, I think, is something that we're going to kind of grapple with over the next few years. People are starting to look at putting policies in place, and it's certainly an area, I think, for strategic focus for a lot of people at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. I'd also mentioned e-portfolios, and just the fact that there is a kind of lack of use of e-portfolios in the sector just now, but I mean there is a lot of potential for the use of the tool, and I think this is an area that that perhaps may change over the next few years, but certainly a number of colleges did indicate they did have the e-portfolio tool, but it wasn't widely used. But we do have many examples of good practice in the use of e-portfolios, and Penny has kindly just put a link in there to some of our case studies focusing on e-portfolios. So if that's an area that interests you, you might want to have a look at some of those case studies. Repositories is another area I think we're going to have a bit more kind of focus and support. There is a lack of awareness around whether a college actually has a repository system or not. We were getting different responses from people in the same college, just having different roles. Some people thought the college did have one, some people weren't sure, some people thought they didn't. So it's certainly an area of awareness raising. There were a few colleges who indicated they did have plans to implement a repository system. And some colleges, a very small number, were actually uploading content to the national repository. And in this instance, we didn't specify which national repository. I suspect it was probably the resource repository, but it might have been the Jordan repository as well. We didn't specifically ask which national repository they were referring to. But again, an area for further work and support, I think. And OERs, I think, is an area that needs a bit more support. We only really asked learning resource staff about their use of open educational resources, and really the information that came back to us was there was a general kind of lack of awareness around OERs. And I think in the next iteration of ETNA, I would really like to open up this question to other staff categories and see what kind of response we get from that. And I think the area of open education in general is one where we're slowly beginning to see an impact. All the information surrounding MOOCs just now, that's quite a hot topic, and people are starting to talk about that in the sector, although there's a fair bit of debate about the impact that it's going to have in further education. And in Scotland in particular, there's been a lot of focus around open badges, and I think this is an area to watch out for. I'm particularly interested in the potential of open badges as a motivational tool or a reward tool for participating in CPD, and perhaps that might be a motivator for getting more involved in online CPD sessions as well. And it's an area that the RSC are doing a lot of work in, and they host an open badges group which I'm involved in, so it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over the next couple of years. But if you're interested in finding out more about the potential of open education or open badges, there's a wee link that Penny will paste shortly into the chat panel, and this is just highlighting the work of Open Scotland. And this followed on from an Open Scotland Summit which was organised by CETIS just before the summer in June, and there is a wee bit of momentum happening around that at the moment. So we would kind of keep an eye and see what happens there and see what kind of impact that has in the future as well. So I seem to have my mouse back. I managed to move on to the final slide all by myself. So all of those links are available there, and what I'll maybe do is just, I don't know if I put that final link in. Sorry, I can get that final link to you that I spoke about. Oh, there it is there. Brilliant, thank you. Penny's just put that in there. So yeah, so that's the kind of overview and my thoughts about the findings from the most recent ETNA survey. And what I'm going to do now is just stop talking. Talked for longer than I said I was going to. I think we always do, and just see if there's any comments come through in the chat panel, and also invite you to come in with any thoughts or comments that you may have. So feel free just to use the chat panel, or if you want to use your mic, if you have a mic available, if you just use the hand raising tool, which you'll find just underneath your name, it's the third icon from the left, and that will let me know that you want to come in via your mic if you have any thoughts or comments. So I can see that Stephen is typing just now, so I'll just I'll hold back and see what comes into the chat panel. And I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts or comments. It is really, I think just getting the opportunity to highlight some of the findings, I think is quite useful, and certainly we find it a useful tool to kind of focus what our delivery and our support. And Stephen, you just come in with your comment then. You were interested in around the integration of MIS and other systems. So the MIS and other systems isn't an area that I particularly focus on. I know my colleague Mark does a lot of work in that, so I haven't particularly focused around that. However, Penny is maybe going to come in and rescue me here and come in with a wee comment about that.
Thank you, Celeste. Hi, Stephen. Our colleague, as Celeste has said, Mark Clark, is actually involved in a Jisc study just now looking at the procurement of or the development of a national MIS system. So I'm sure Jisc will publish the findings from that. I think it's finishing at the end of the year, so if you speak to Mark Clark at Jisc Scotland or Rob Engelbright at Jisc, he'll be able to give you more details on it. Cheers.
Thanks, Penny. And Candy is coming in here with a comment, and you're saying that we've mentioned the move over the years from digital competency to digital fluency. Do you think that reflects more training in these areas in colleges, or simply as a result of the increased use of technology in life in general? I think that there has been a focus on training in particular technologies within the colleges, but I think it's probably, my opinion is it's probably a mixture of both. I think the reality is that people do use technology as part of their daily lives. There's no getting away from that fact, and this is obviously going to influence their technology skills and their abilities to use certain technologies in their workplace. But certainly I think there is a need for a kind of focus on kind of the digital literacy and people having confidence in using technology. I think confidence is a big aspect of it, and it was certainly good to see the confidence in using many of what we would call kind of administrative tools coming across in the survey, things like using word processing packages, using emails. And I think when we first started the ETNA surveys, there weren't confidence in using this type of technology. So I think technology skills will continue to evolve, and I don't think we're ever going to be at the stage where we're quite happy with our technology skill set. But I think that's a difficult one to answer. I think it's a combination. Well, my thought is it's a combination. I don't know what you think yourself, Candy, whether you think it's been a focused attempt on particular technology training, or if you think it's just life in general and the fact that we're having to use technology as part of our daily lives. I can see a few people still typing in the chat panel there. Combination, you're agreeing with me. Yeah, I think a difficult one to answer, but I think it is and Gary, you're just saying goodbye. Thanks for joining us. It's nice of you to join us all the way from the west of England. And Penny's just agreeing with that combination thought there. So I don't know if we have any more questions or comments, and a few people are having to leave us now. We're kind of getting towards the time that I think is the session is scheduled to finish. So I'll just pause briefly so I can see Candy is still typing. Yep. So you're just agreeing with me. We've come to a natural end for the session. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully you found that useful. If you get anything that you want to follow up, please do get in touch with us. But thank you very much for your interest. Thanks everyone. Goodbye.